All right, let's get the show on the road. First of all, thanks everyone for joining. This is what I think our third in-person meetup of the IxDF, I think.
Yeah.
Third in-person activity. So thanks for making the time and thanks for joining us on a work day. So I know everyone has had a long day already, but it's good to have you here. So there are going to be three parts to what we're going to be doing today. There's a little bit of an introduction to some of the core ideas, which is kind of like the more presentation-y part, but it's relatively short. And then there's a game, like a couple of games I'd like us to play, which are really focused on helping you develop some of the fundamental techniques in speaking and storytelling. But it's very easy. So regardless of whether you've never done this before or, well, let me not say easy. It's accessible. So whether you've never done this before or you're pretty experienced, the games are really useful to help you develop skills because even up to now, they help me practice and sort of develop my skills. And then the third part, which you might need either a device or a place to write, is the workshop element where you'll start to actually work on developing your own little story or narrative. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So with the first part, we get to decide how we want to start. Do we want to start with the sort of core ideas or do we want to start with the game? And I'll maybe do a little bit of a show of hands. Who would like to hear a little bit more of my voice versus who would like to play a little bit of a game? And we'll maybe do by a show of hands. Who wants to start with the game? Hands up. Let's see. Nobody. Everyone wants to finish eating. That's great. The game next. That's totally cool. Okay. So maybe a little bit about myself. My name's Alfi. I'm Alfi Oloo. I'm a product designer. I currently work at Yoko. But I'd say that all of that stuff is a little bit less important today because outside of that, one of the things that I guess you could say is somewhat different about me. So I'm dyslexic, so reading and like that kind of stuff is really not my game. And so from the time that I was really young, speaking was really where I kind of made up for that lack. And so I've had experience speaking at sort of local stages, at UX South Africa, for example, a couple of different companies. I've had the honor of speaking at TEDx. I've also had the honor of also speaking overseas in Australia. And so I've kind of had a pretty broad spectrum of experience when it comes to public speaking. But more than just actually being able to be on stage, telling stories is something that is integral to my personality and who I am. And so today what I'm hoping to do is to provide a some foundational ideas that will help you kind of take some of those first steps that are specifically challenging. And I think anybody who's kind of like, let me actually just see by show of hands, who's kind of either spoken at a conference or a meetup or something like that before. I know it was in the form, but I just kind of want the room to get a sense of it.
How serious is the noise?
If there were 2 people in your audience, you're winning. Okay, cool. All right. That's good. So we're looking at over 50% of us. And I think for each one of you, especially in the times where you have to submit a talk, there's like this moment where you see the thing on Instagram and you're like, oh, that would be cool. And then you open the Google form and then you're like, okay, what am I actually going to talk about? And I think a lot of people get stuck at that stage. So one of the things we're going to be looking at is how do you actually get started? How do you choose a topic to speak about that is going to be relevant, firstly, to your audience and grab their attention, but at the same time, something that's interesting to you? Because there's always this like, dilemma of like, do I speak about the things that I really, really know well? But then are those things going to be boring because everybody kind of really knows them well? I think like speaking about design thinking is a good example of that. Granted, there are many people who are developing their foundations, but at the same time, there might be some people who've kind of done it so many times that they're not really, engaged with what you're going to be talking about. So, let me get my little clipper to work. Oh, I was pressing the wrong side. Cool. So, this guide is specifically aimed at equipping you with the tools you need to tell stories in multiple different formats. So as I said, it might be conference talks, it might be presentations, it might be speaking to individuals, and you might use it for interviews. Now, there are 5 basic parts of this which we're going to be exploring. The first is framing your story. And that's kind of what you use to decide what you want to talk about, because we often think about a theme as the title of a person's talk, and that's what their talk is about. But it's actually not exactly right, because a really good talk is framed with a question. And the entire talk is the process of actually helping your audience answer that question in their mind. Then we'll talk a little bit about narrative techniques, the different things that you can use to help you through the process, both of building your talk as well as delivering it. Then we'll go to the tools of persuasion. And I think this is kind of where we dip into the annals of history and look at how some of the older orators in ancient Greek, like Aristotle, approach the idea of persuasion and how those ideas have kind of lived all the way to now. And if anyone here is in advertising, often you'll find when they're developing strategies, they'll use these same sort of core ideas. They're called ethos, pathos, and logos, but we'll get more into that a little bit later on. Then we'll explore the narrative arc. Now, the narrative arc is a little bit more focused on storytelling broadly. So some of the previous tools are a lot more about the spoken word, but the narrative arc is used in screenwriting, it's used in writing books, it's used in writing movie scripts, all kinds of storytelling, it'll be relevant. Also, maybe another thing to mention, for those of you, I don't know if I got everybody's email, but to most of you, I would have sent an email out that has kind of got the links to the FigJam, as well as another link that you will need. But if you don't have it, there should be a QR code, or you can actually also just visit it on your phone. And then lastly, we'll kind of dive into the workshop activity. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Any questions? Anything that's not clear? Wonderful. Okay, so we start with the seed question, actually choosing what you want to talk about. Now, the reason why I think this has been really important for me is because I'm a very talkative person, and I know people can kind of get tired of it, especially if it's not something that they're interested in. Now, what a seed question does is it essentially begins to write your talk in the mind of the audience. Because an effective seed question does three things. The first thing it does is it allows you to put a little bit of yourself into what it is that you're talking about. It allows you to make room for your lived experience. It also allows you to tap into the niche of your audience. So for example, if I'm speaking to a group of UX designers, I don't want to be talking about astrophysics because none of us really relate with that. I want to talk about something which each one of you can relate to in your own lives. And finally, we want to tap into universal resonance, something that every single human on this planet can relate to in some or other way. And so I'm first going to show you a short video. For some of you that kind of saw the clip online, you'll sort of recognize this, but it'll kind of show, I'd like to explain a little bit of how I use the C question to sort of frame a broader talk. So this is from the TEDx talk that I gave in 2022. Through the pages of history, education has taken many forms. From that of the cave paintings with the hunter-gatherers, to that of craft masters passing down knowledge from master to apprentice, all the way until now with teachers and learners in the modern education system. But today I'd like us to consider something different. I'd like us to consider this question. What does education actually look like when knowledge is no longer a scarce resource that needs to be preserved and disseminated? What does education look like when information is openly and freely accessible? So, essentially what you do when you pose the question at the beginning of your talk is you actually allow a person's mind to start answering the question. Because I could literally now start talking about this because this is something that we all realize. We all know that the internet is now something that's relevant to the education system. And so knowledge is not as scarce as it used to be when everyone was like sort of relying on books and there was a lecturer standing at the front reading from a textbook that nobody else had access to. There are universal and lived truths that each one of us have that make that question specifically relevant to today. And that is what a seed question does. When you're choosing your topic, you want to start with a question which you don't know the answer to yet. And that's the beautiful thing, because the second part that's kind of hard about this process is like, even once you choose a theme, where do you start looking? And if you don't really care about the question, it's going to be a little bit disingenuous to actually go and do that research. Because if you're talking about something that you already know super well, it's kind of going to just be kind of like you're just talking at your audience rather than going through a process of discovery with them. So what a good seed question does is, one, is it hooks your audience. And people talk about hooks when it comes to social media and content a lot. And it's kind of like those first couple of seconds of your video that kind of gets a person to focus. A talk has the same sort of thing. An aspect of how you introduce an idea that makes the idea relevant to what you're going to be talking about. Secondly, it hints at a problem. We all know that the education system is not where it's meant to be. And that is what that question poses, is that there is a societal problem which we need an answer to. And so when you're examining what might be a good seed question for you, you want to ensure that in the question, the problem is either literally described or implicitly posed. Does that make sense so far? Mm-hmm. And then lastly, and most importantly, it should promise a journey ahead. Because a real story is a journey. Is anyone here familiar with the hero's journey? Have you heard that term before? And that is why the hero's journey is such a great sort of umbrella for what it means to tell a good story. Because a real story is a journey, because you're discovering new things along the way. So, in the first version of this talk, I was doing this with people who are entering the design industry. And so we thought of like, what might be a couple of good examples of questions that you could use as a person who is presenting research to, who's thinking about a talk to present to either other designers or to your clients. So for example, how could you reduce user drop-off during onboarding? Any business cares about that question. And if you start your presentation with that, immediately in your client's mind, it's clear like, okay, we're thinking about a specific part of my business. This is the people who are newly entering. It's also relevant because new users means more money. It's like all of the context of what we're going to be talking about is built into that question. And so even if you're doing a presentation about a design or whatever it is that like a prototype or whatever it might be, you always want to start with a question so that the framing of what is going to follow is clear. A couple of others, why are users not discovering new features? Also very relevant, because if you're not building new features, you're essentially wasting all of your development time. So, and I maybe won't go into the last one, but what you want to do by posing a question is make clear that the things that you're going to be talking about answer this question, which obviously means that you need to actually be able to answer the question. Cool. So that's kind of like the first part. Are we on the same page so far?
Yeah.
Cool. Also, please feel free to interrupt me. Feel free to ask questions as we go. Like, this doesn't need to go like completely linearly. There's something you want me to go back to that wasn't entirely clear. Feel free to do so. I'm not against interruptions at all. Yes. When you do ask a question, maybe just give us your name first.
Oh, my name is Yang.
Yang.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, those were very specific, I guess, problems that you start talking about in design. How would you go about, such as like a full app design presentation or something? How would you just say the problems of the actual users that currently don't have the solution, or would it be a different? Let's say, for example, you're making a new e-commerce shopping app. Mm-hmm. How would you present?
Okay, maybe just give me a bit more context. So, like, what are we selling on this e-commerce app?
Let's say, for example, cars.
Cars. Okay, cool. Yeah. All right. So, what I would want to do is frame my question around what is unique about what I'm presenting. So, let's say we're presenting an e-commerce platform, and a great thing about our platform is, you've got a 3D view of the car in the e-commerce platform, so you can actually get an internal view. The question that I would ask is something to the effect of, what does it mean to shop online with an in-person experience? You essentially in your question want to foreshadow what you're going to be talking about. Now, I mean, that's obviously coming off the top of my head, so it's not absolutely perfect. And one thing that is also important to realize is when you're developing a seed question, the question that you start with may not necessarily be the question that you end with. Because at first you might pose a question and you start to do your research, and as you do research, it becomes clear that the real question is actually different from where you started. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions? Yes.
I guess it kind of goes to that, is like that would be overarching, but I guess in a lot of cases you might be addressing multiple problems, but then would it be rather just choose the biggest one, so they're like the USP of the site that you're looking at? Or would you try and, I guess, group together a bunch of questions? Yeah, so how do you address it if you're on a presentation where you're going to be going through, hey, these are the 3 different kind of things that we've done? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
or 3 problems that you kind of addressed?
So what I would want to do is use the question that is immediately the most capturing, because see, like especially in your presentation. Okay, so two points there that are somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, you want to use a question that is the most attention grabbing because it's the beginning. But another sort of way forward, and what you'll also find, especially with really experienced speakers, is they won't explicitly say the question. So a great version of this, which we'll dive into a little bit better, a little bit more later, is Martin Luther King's speech. There's no place where he says like, this is this, like, why is racism bad? That doesn't exist in his speech. But we all realize by how he speaks what the question he's trying to address is, and we'll kind of dive a little bit deeper into that specific example. I think it's actually in this next part. Any other questions before we move on? Cool. So you have a seed question, and you kind of have a rough idea of where you want to take your talk, right? You haven't yet done the research, and we'll kind of get into something a little bit more structured when we enter the workshop. But the next thing that I want to talk about is essentially 3 questions you can ask yourself when you're planning to tell a story that'll help you make that story better. Now, the reason that I put these here, and it's a little bit less structured than the workshop itself, is because this can be used from like a 5-minute phone call to like a 2-hour talk. These 3 questions, by ensuring that what you're going to talk about answers these 3 questions, you'll ensure that you're not just talking at a person, but actually telling them a story. Because there are specific characteristics that make something specifically a story. And the first one is, what is at stake? It's like, why is it important that this question gets answered? Now, if we think about the example that we just watched, education and the fact that knowledge is no longer scarce. Essentially, the thing that is at stake by that question is the education system. Essentially, all the children of our society and of our world. That is what's at stake. Them being able to realize their potential. Now, I don't actually say that, but it's implied by the question that we asked. So a good story ensures, especially at the beginning, it answers what exactly it is that's at stake while you're telling the story. Both what is at stake in the context of the story, but also what is at stake for the audience. Because when I was giving that presentation, for example, I knew that there were going to be parents in the audience. And those parents would have children. And those children are currently going through the schooling system, and they have had issues in that context. So it's clear what is at stake for them to be able to answer that question. And if we think then about, for example, the e-commerce question that you posed, it's like you being able to sell more cars is what's at stake, which is essentially your business. And so by your question, you want to make sure that in the presentation that you're giving, you make clear at the beginning what is at stake. Then what is in the way, or the obstacle? Because if there was nothing in the way, it wouldn't be a story. Like, I mean, imagine, for example, like in The Dark Knight, like the Joker doesn't exist in the story. It's just like Batman arrives and there are no bad guys and Gotham. And that's the end of it. It's like, that's not a story. So the what is in the way? So you want to ensure when you're talking, so you've kind of said, okay, there is something at stake, right? If we think about the example I was talking about, it's like the children's future is what's at stake. Okay, what is standing in the way of those children realizing their future? Well, it's one, the fact that the education system is not working as it should. I've actually got a couple of examples, so let me not rush it. Let me not rush too far into examples. The third one is what had to change. So if there is an obstacle and there is a goal, essentially stakes are the goal, there has to be something that changes about the context in order to show true progression. And this is what turns it into a journey, is that you're in one state, you have something that you want to achieve, you're going to the thing that you want to achieve, and there is an obstacle. You hit against that obstacle, you change, and as a result, you're able to overcome it. That is essentially what happens in every significant story. And there's a little piece that's written here, and some of you might not be able to read it at the back. But it says, essentially what you want to do in any story, regardless of how long it is build a whole lot of context that uncovers a 5-second moment of change where everything pivots. If if you who here watched Inception? So there's that moment where the coin is spinning at the end of the movie, and everything essentially comes to that moment. It's like, are we in reality or are we in a dream? And that is the five, because essentially everything up until that point is about that moment. And it's just that 5-second moment of change. And one of the things that's really funny about it is that you don't actually know because the coin doesn't stop spinning. Like the movie ends first. But essentially that's what you want to do. You want to provide a whole lot of context and then a moment of change, because what a story truly does and what distinguishes it from simply talking and communicating is that there is actually a change that occurs in your audience. Are we on the same page so far? So talking about a couple of examples. So in the TEDx talk that I gave, the thing that was at stake is that the purpose of education has changed, because when this existing system was introduced, the purpose was to ensure that as many people get the knowledge as possible. What they do with the knowledge, essentially, we were like, that's not the real problem because most people can't read. But that has changed. And so we know that there's something true at stake. If we think, for example, at Martin Luther King's speech, the thing he talks about is freedom of all races and the fulfillment of human potential. That is what's at stake in the speech that he gave. And so that's the first thing that we want to ensure. And in his speech, this is one of the things that's immediately clear in what he introduces. Then we think about the obstacle. So in my talk, the one specific obstacle. So my talk was broken down into 3 parts, and each part essentially speaks to one of these problems. The one was archaic methods. So old methods of trying to teach was one of the significant obstacles I tackled. The fact that education is cookie cutter, we somehow assume that even though we know everybody is unique, we somehow assume we can educate everyone the same way. And finally, that there is a lot of irrelevant content. A whole bunch of people go through school, go through university, and then they're not ready to start a job. And so those were the obstacles or challenges that I wanted to address or overcome. And then if you think about Martin Luther King's speech, it was specifically racism and specifically race-based judgment. Now, if we think about the moment of change, let me actually see who might be able to give us a bit of a guess. What was the actual transformation that Martin Luther King was trying to communicate through giving his speech? It's also said in the speech. Does anyone have a sense? Yeah?
It's like his dream, right? It's his vision.
What was that change of his, like, that his dream was? Like, can you articulate it?
Like everyone to be equal, like a society that's...
Pretty close. You're like 90% of the way there.
Is it the fact that everybody has a dream about something? Is he really fix that?
Not entirely. Yes?
That people, like what you have there, race-based judgment, that race-based judgment doesn't exist, essentially, because everybody is in together.
Also really close, but what if not that, then what? Because you see, the race-based judgment is the obstacle. What is the thing that he says we should do instead? Judge not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And that is the transformation is exemplified in that specific sentence. And that's usually the moment, the climax of any like really good story or talk, is that there is a moment where the question that was posed, either implicitly or explicitly, gets answered at a specific moment, and typically that is the climax. And so, for example, in mine, it was essentially introducing the idea of self-directed learning and making use of exponential technologies like the internet and so on, but let's not get too far into that. But essentially what you do when explaining the transformation is you reveal the deeper truth that lies underneath the question. Okay, I'm almost done, I promise. Because I would like us to get to some of the interactive elements. So the third part, and what I mentioned, we'll be talking about, has a little bit more of a historical relevance. And that's specifically techniques of persuasion. Now, I think everybody kind of wishes that, everyone would just listen to what you said immediately as you said it, and you could be this benevolent dictator that rules the world to a certain degree. I think some more than others. But until that day comes, all we can really do is be as persuasive as we can and share the ideas which we think will benefit other people. And to be able to do that, we have to be able to persuade people. And so I'd like to introduce you to a very, very interesting author. He's written 2 really important books. I read the one long before I read the other. So the one book is How to Speak, How to Listen by Dr. Mortimer J. Adler. And the other book, which is somewhat ironic, is called How to Read a Book, which you might think is a little bit counterintuitive. But if you read it, it's actually a really, really good one. But in this book, he talks about these 3 ideas, the tools of persuasion. Now, he's a lot more recent. I think I don't think he's alive anymore, but he was around in the late 19th century, or well, the 90s, sorry. In the 90s, was when he was doing the majority of his work. And in it, he goes back to examine Aristotle. So Aristotle is one of the people who really, really exposed these ideas in a broader context. And these are the Greek names, if I'm not mistaken. So there's first ethos. Do I have the whole 3? No. Okay, so the first is ethos. And ethos is essentially your credibility. Why is it that you should listen to what I'm saying as a speaker? Because too often people think like what I need is like this graph that is going to blow people's mind, or this specific statistic that's going to make them realize how important the thing I'm talking about is. But in actual fact, before people will listen to anything that you say, they need to believe that you have something worthwhile. And if you remember how I started this, the first thing that I spoke about is the different talks that I've given, the different places I've given talks, the fact that I've got real experience in this. So that you know everything I speak about, regardless of how real and tangible and evidence-based what I talk about is, you at least know that I've done this a couple of times, and you can assume that I've done it somewhat successfully, given the fact that I've done it more than once. So that's the first part. That's your ethos. And then you get pathos, which is your a lot more centered around emotion. So once people know that this person is worth listening to, the next thing that you do, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, especially because people believe somehow that they're logical creatures, that is actually not real. And I think, especially as designers who have seen users trying to use a product, there is zero logic to how they use it. Actually, we have emotions that drive us, and then we seek to justify our emotions using logical reasoning. And so what you want to do when you're delivering a talk is first make the emotional case for why what you're saying is important, and then give them reasons to justify their emotions. And that's what pathos focuses on, the emotional resonance of what you're talking about. And then finally, logos, which somewhat sounds like logic, is a logical argument for what you're saying. And that's where you essentially want to end. That is also why the moment of transformation, so these 3 steps are reflected, let's go a little bit back, in these 3 cases. You'll see that like what is in the way speaks to the emotional element, because there is a goal that I want and there is something in the way. Well, if I look at what had to change, this change happens as a result of logic, because people know not always to trust their emotions. But if both their emotions and their logic are saying the same thing, they are much more likely to be persuaded that it is a meaningful element. So these are kind of like the 3 elements. And so, okay, I've essentially already explained each one of these. So the emotional relevance. So establishing your credibility. So let me maybe just briefly talk. What is the time? Okay, the next couple. So one of the ways that there are a couple of different ways that you can establish your authority from an ethos perspective. The one is through credentials. You can show the fact that you've done specific things. The second, somewhat, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, but it is by sort of downplaying your experience in a way that gets people to feel like you're being humble. And it might seem a little bit manipulative, but it really, really works. Especially if in the content you're going to prove that you're actually really capable. Because then everything that you say after that, they'll assume, oh, this person's being more humble than he actually is, and he's actually got real stuff he or she has got real stuff to tell me. And then the other one is also by sort of drawing a parallel or relation to other people who have credibility. So me, for example, putting myself with Martin Luther King is one way you might do that. Now, I cannot claim to be nearly as good as he is, but it's a great way to sort of allow your audience to relate you to the idea of credibility. So then we talk about pathos. So connecting emotionally, and there are many different ways that you can do this. One of the ones, which is something we'll practice in the game, is about using tone, slowing down in the way you talk, and then really focusing on something important and looking at someone and connecting with them. You see, there are many different ways that you can tap into emotion. And the reason that it's really important is if you can tap into emotion both with your content, with your body language, with your tone of voice, it provides a fidelity of communication that writing cannot achieve, that pictures cannot achieve, even that videos really struggle to achieve. Because eye contact is not the same when somebody's standing in front of you and looking at you compared to a video that you're watching. And one of the things we know about human senses is we trust our senses when all our senses are telling us the same thing. Like if you can hear something and you can't see it, you suspect it's there, but you're not really sure. If you can see it and you can hear it, you're like, okay, this is probably real. If you can see it, hear it, and feel it, it's like, it's real. And so that's what you want to do. You want to have multiple different layers of communication that are saying the same thing. And then finally, the logical appeal. I won't go too much into this one because it's a little bit technical, but it's essentially you making the logical argument or evidence-based argument for why the emotions that they felt should be trusted. Okay. The last aspect of this, before we step into the game, is the narrative arc. So this is what I talked about that both screenwriters, storytellers, movie writers, all of them essentially use. And what the narrative arc essentially does is it tells you a little bit about the emotional experience that a person is going on, but also the story beats that are used. So has anyone heard of the 3-act system that's used in stories? Essentially the beginning, middle, and end. It sounds kind of simple, but it's actually really profound. And so in this first part, just my little TV is doing an red dots. So in the first part, you kind of have the beginning, the setup. Now what you want to do in this stage is essentially set the status quo. You see, for there to be change, there has to be the standard or the default or the status quo. And so the beginning of any good story illustrates that. It's like the long, long ago in a land. Like that's already setting the status quo. And what you want to do in this beginning piece is the inciting incident. What happened that made this story not part of long, long ago? Why is it a story? Because when you say long, long ago, you're saying that everything before that moment is kind of like the history. But that moment is where something important happened. And that's what your inciting incident is. You set all the context, and then something happens that kind of gets the ball rolling. And then you step into the middle, and this is essentially the rising action. Where things start to happen, you typically introduce, if this is sort of like the typical protagonist-antagonist situation, typically your antagonist gets introduced here at the rising action. If we think, for example, about, well, The Dark Knight is a little bit of a different example because you're introduced to the Joker at the beginning, but then you don't see him for quite a while. And you kind of, you meet Bruce Wayne and you kind of see all of that kind of stuff and the Batman aspect of things. And then the Joker does some more shenanigans. And then he really, really gets introduced. And that's essentially what you want to do. And in that context, the Joker is the obstacle. And so the obstacle gets introduced in this middle piece, right? And the antagonist and the protagonist fight against one another. They fight against one another until this stage, the climax, where a specific change has to happen. And that is essentially where your change occurs. But also, it is also the point at which the lesson or the answer to the initial question is revealed. And then you have your resolution, essentially, which is where the results of the lesson are sort of illustrated. It's like you present your website, then you've got this beautiful prototype that you show them, and then as a result, we can project this much money or this many new users. So that's kind of when you talk about the result of what you're doing. And maybe pause there. Any questions, any thoughts, anything not clear? Yes.
I just wanted to ask regarding past ethos,
Yes.
pathos, and logos. Out of those three, which would you say would be? I know all three are important, but which would you say you can live without, regard when you go into storytelling per se?
You can live with, logic. Definitely. Because people will make up their own reasons. How many people justify their emotions with things that make no sense? But if they don't think you're worth listening to, it's a non-starter. And if you get their emotions, they'll find reasons to justify them. Now, sometimes they may. Now, this is the important bit. Sometimes they may find reasons and believe it, and then they find out that their reasons aren't actually real, and then they'll doubt it later on. So, for example, if you kind of go with it and then you don't have any sort of evidence, and then they go do their own research, and the research that they do disqualifies what you say, essentially you kind of convince them, and then they'll sort of, exactly. That's why you kind of want to have that. But what I would say is often that can be left, especially if it's a question which society doesn't have an answer for yet. Sometimes there isn't a logical argument. You just know that it's a problem because of an emotional sense that you have. So I'd say it's definitely the one that can be ignored.
So if like philosophical stuff would be like big, so logos would not be as, because it is also based on, I guess, perception of if you discuss it, philosophy with someone.
Well, I would say when you're discussing philosophy, reasons are extremely important because essentially because it's intangible, reasons become so much more important. Because it's important to distinguish between evidence and logic. Because there are things that you can reason through logic which you can't find evidence for. Because logic isn't essentially like ironclad, while evidence at least purports to be. Make sense?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
Can you give an example of like an inciting incident? I sometimes struggle with like the storytelling arc, how to actually get that to be like in a presentation form or something. So like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
an example of that. The context background I think is easy. I guess conflict as well is like if it's a user that's really struggling with something in a test that you did, or would that be the inciting incident? So yeah.
So I can actually give you a real example. So maybe like 5-6 years ago, I used to work at ABSA, and when I was working on the banking app at that time, and I was specifically in charge of the savings and investments, well, at least at that time, that's what I was working on. And so if I was talking to a client about that, right, I'm now presenting my research to them. What I would say is, I'm in charge of the savings and investments portfolio, and we were doing some discovery research. And one of the things that really struck me, which I believe we as a group need to take advantage of, is specifically that we found that one of the things that's unique about South Africa is people, even with significant dependence and financial responsibility, feel like they aren't financially capable, specifically almost financially illiterate. And that is an exciting incident because savings and investments exist in many businesses, and it's something that's relevant to my client. But there is something specifically that I learned, which I think you need to hear. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you kind of, the inciting incident almost goes hand in hand with the question.
Yeah.
Because the question sort of poses the whole thing. The inciting incident is kind of like, what happened that made me realize this question is important? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Typically what you want to do with it is try to make it as specific a moment as possible.
Yeah.
That's when it really, really hits.
And then I guess the conflict is kind of just then you actually go into a little bit more depth about the problem that you realized in that instance.
Like, why do people believe that they're not financially literate?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. Oh, let's not get too far. So,
Sorry, I have a question. So,
Yes.
for example, what would be the climax then?
so the climax would have been the insight of my research. So the thing that we first realized was the fact that people feel like they're financially illiterate. Then I'd kind of go into, okay, so we did this research, we spoke to this many users, and that's kind of like building up some of the evidence and so on. And then, do I remember what the insight of our findings were? Two really important ones was being able to communicate financial performance in comparison to other people at your level. Because people also feel like they're not really sure how are my finances in order, or like, am I kind of like not really making it? Will I be able to buy a house or not? Like, they have all of those questions. And so the real insight was like, we don't actually have to educate them about everything related to finance. There are specific things that if you sort of help them learn, they will do the work of developing their own insights further. But essentially what you want to do is have the insight that you found be the answer to the question. Make sense? Yes. Oh, sorry, maybe before you do you mind the two of you just giving your names as well, just so that people can get to know? Sorry?
Tanea.
And yours?
Serena.
Serena.
Mornay.
Mornay?
With the rising action parts,
Mhm.
there's usually a conflict that helps
Yes.
to build to a climax.
Mhm.
You see it in pretty much every single sphere movie everywhere.
True.
They all
True.
follow these extremes. Avatar did it as well.
Mm.
So is it possible to build to a climax without depending on an antagonist or conflict or a tension?
So you mentioned three very different things. So you can do it without an antagonist. You can't do it without conflict. And the way that I would distinguish the two is an antagonist is specifically a person or character. But sometimes the conflict is internal conflict. And so the antagonist and the protagonist are the same person, but it's different aspects of their personality. Sometimes the antagonist is a context or a system. And so you do need, and essentially what I did in this presentation that sort of speaks to what you're describing is, instead of describing an antagonist, I talked about an obstacle. So an obstacle contains both antagonists, but also environmental obstacles. Does that make sense?
So you need the obstacles to.
Yeah, you have to. Otherwise it's not really a story.
Okay.
And now look, it's not to say that it can't be valuable. Let's just be clear about that. So for example, a
It's gonna be
textbook.
boring.
Exactly. Exactly. But and sometimes boring is okay. It's like you don't need your calculator to tell you a story about why 4 + 6 is 10. You just need it to give you the answer. But then when you're talking about other things, you might need interest. Does that make sense? Cool. I saw another hand up. Go for a second.
It was more a comment. And as in like I find it fun to watching paint dry. Like one of the videos, like 1 hour just watching paint dry.
This is true. This is true. Okay, cool. Any other questions before I move on? All right. So that's kind of like the overview of the narrative arc. Now, how you actually use a narrative arc, and this is kind of how I typically go about it. I kind of make this table, and you essentially have the 4 primary categories of the narrative arc, and then I kind of have 2 columns underneath that. I first write out the key point. What is the thing I actually want to say, right? And then I'll write that literally in bullet points, right? And then after that, one of the things which we hear people in literature talk about so often is the show, don't tell. But for you to be able to show, you first need to know what you want to tell. And so you actually need to do both if you want to be really good at storytelling. You first identify what are the things I want to say at each stage, and then how am I actually going to illustrate that using essentially narrative techniques and story and character development and world building and so on. And that, if I'm not mistaken, okay, this is actually not relevant for right now, but essentially how, when I'm listening to a talk, this is essentially how I evaluate it, using narrative flow, use of ethos, pathos, logos, vocal tone and rhythm, which we'll kind of get into now, and then the use of descriptive language. And when you're listening to a talk, this is essentially a great way that you can use to evaluate the effectiveness of communication, not necessarily the content. And I think that leads us, okay, so before we get to Fig Jam, we're going to play some games. Are we ready?
Yes.
All right. So there are 2 different ways we can do this, and I kind of want to get a bit of a sense. So we can either break up into groups and do it like that, so everybody gets a chance to sort of be the guinea pig, you might say, or we can all do it together and kind of have a couple of people volunteer to take the floor. Let's see by a show of hands who wants to do it in groups. Who wants to do it everyone together? Okay, of the people who want to do it with everyone together, who doesn't want to actually speak and so chose that? No, I'm kidding. Look, so maybe what I can do is we can do like 1 or 2 together, and then we'll break up into groups. And if you really feel strongly about not doing it, if you maybe are get stage fright or you seem extremely anxious, that's okay. Don't. I encourage you to push yourself, but don't hurt yourself. Let me say. All right. So what I'll maybe first do is just make a couple of group leaders. So we'll maybe need like 5 groups. 5 groups, yeah. 5 groups should be good. Let's see who'd like to be a group leader. Just put up your hand. And if obviously if people don't, if not enough people become group leaders, I'll choose people. Okay, so you can be okay. Cool. Tanea 1, Mariska 2. Your name?
Lindy.
Lindy. You can be 3.
Evan.
Kevin.
Evan.
Evan.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yes. And then you can be 4, and I can maybe be 5. All right. So for the people who are group leaders, you'll either need to use your phone or a laptop, because you'll need to go to this site. And maybe in the meantime, I'll ask that you go to ultraspeaking.com and just sign up. So this is a public website, so you can come here and play some of these games in your own time. Yes?
Or you can just sign up.
Yeah, it's free. Yeah. Well, there's a paid version, but there's also a free version. So what we're going to do is head over to games. Now, so there are a couple of different... Oh, no, one sec, stay there. There are a couple of different free ones, and then there are also some paid ones. But essentially, and what I love about this website specifically is instead of focusing on some of the more lofty things, like what I talked about, it teaches you like the really basic and tangible skills. So one of the things that it shows you how to do is how to, instead of focusing on trying to get a conference and have this sort of big process to practice, gives you a specific topic and you just speak about it for a short time. So what you'll do is you'll go to timer. So there are 2 games I want us to play, and we'll I'd like each person to get a turn to do it, and we'll maybe start at, let's say, a minute and a half. And so what's going to happen is when you start, it's going to give you a theme, and you talk for a minute and a half about that game. Like, there's no preparation, there's no practice. It's like, it's hard for everyone. Nobody gets it perfectly. Even the guy who developed this whole website and business struggles with it as well. So don't feel like you need to be perfect. The thing that you're trying to learn here is specifically that you actually can talk about anything if you're willing to just talk. Cool. So I'm going to give it a try first, and then after I give it a try, I'm going to ask someone to volunteer to also give it a try. Okay. Living in a diverse world. It's a very interesting one for me, especially because of where I come from. So I'm originally from Kenya, but I grew up here in South Africa. And one of the things that I learned about it, which is really interesting to me, is because I'm a Kenyan and not a South African. Oh, sorry, a little bit of different context. So I grew up in Pretoria. The primary school I went to was, I think we were like 4 black guys in the entire grade, and the grade was 100 people. And so there was this kind of like weird context of like, I never really fit in because, I mean, I'm obviously, visually you can see that I'm not white, but at the same time, I only speak English. And so when I was in the one crowd, I was sort of like the outer person because I don't speak the language. And then among black people, I don't speak vernac, so there was always like, you're a little bit of an outsider thing. And one of the things that it taught me is how to communicate and engage with people beyond language. And I think that's one of the really important things about living in a diverse world, is that diversity is important and relevant, but it is the things that make us the same that are really useful. And that is one of the things that I learned. And I learned it I learned implicitly as a kid, but as I got older, it became more and more important. And so I think the beautiful thing about living in a diverse world is that although that there is always diversity, it's the things that make us the same that are important. And that is what I have for you today. Now, plenty of mistakes. Like, I had to do a whole bunch of rolling back. And I even repeated the ending twice. But the important thing is that I started and I spoke until the end. And those are the only 2 things. Try to start well and speak until the end. If you can achieve those 2 things, you will grow. And I promise you, with like 2 weeks of practicing this on an ongoing basis, and one of the things that's really important is, besides presentations and all that, you will get better at everyday conversations. Because you will realize that the thing that's standing between you and speaking effectively is opening your mouth. So, do we have a volunteer who wants to give us a try? Come on. Please, Evan.
Okay, so my thoughts on the corporate world, having myself worked in many corporates, so my job as a UX designer, is that it's really money driven. And I think a lot of sort of corporates really kind of miss the mark when their sole focus becomes nothing but increasing revenue. And so what they often do is they will actually sort of end up doing bad things or create experiences for the consumers that aren't good in the long term in order to create revenue in the short term. And so regarding different thoughts in the corporate world, like you can get to a point where it's really difficult to operate within those companies and really improve them. And trying to appeal to different board members or actual stakeholders within those organizations becomes a extremely critical skill. Be able to appeal to them on an emotional level, being able to persuade them why certain things are important, and just generally speaking, your ability to convince others becomes such an important thing within the corporate world. And so we can kind of see a pivotal sort of place in sort of late stage capitalism where basically you have companies that are very much only money driven, and those companies are quite short sighted. They're going to fall behind. Yeah.
Nice. Well done. Well done. Okay, does anyone have some feedback for Evan? Any thoughts? How did he do?
To be honest, guys.
Yeah. There's going to be feedback throughout this. Like when we play the games, between each person's turn, we want to give one another feedback. Yes?
Well, I mean, obviously it's difficult, very difficult. Not taking away from that. But two things, just kind of keeping aware of the time so that you can get a strong ending.
Yes.
And then voice variation,
Mm-hmm.
meaning realizing when you have clutch words.
Yeah.
I do that. But just being aware of those and trying to separate them.
Yeah.
Definitely. Those are good ones. I especially like what you said about the strong ending, because more often than not, people just remember the end of what you said, even though you put so much work into everything else. It kind of just so a strong ending is really important. What I like about what you did is the strong start, because that's one of the things that can kind of trip you up for like most of what you're going to say. So you did that really well. One of the things that I'd also sort of suggest, especially if you're trying to speak like on your feet, is essentially just say one thing with either examples or like analogies, but you're essentially saying one thing. And I think like, I mean, a minute and a half is pretty long, so you can maybe say a couple more. But if you find that you feel like you're either going to get stuck or not sure what you want to say, just kind of say one thing for a long time. Yeah. Anyone else would like to try? We'll do maybe one more in this game. Please. Yes. Yes.
Okay, you can go.
There's another game, don't worry. You ready?
No.
That's good.
Oh my gosh. This one in front of a bunch of designers. I think this feels like a question that they ask you in an interview, and you have to answer with a very logical answer of like, yes, we tested it, we had statistics, there was an uptick in usage, and there was conversion, and you can prove it very logically with examples from your designs. But I think what makes a great design, apart from those logical statistic things, is if you can build something that your users have an emotional connection with, as well as something that you can learn from it. I feel like design can never be perfect. There's too many factors. Our world changes so much. People's attention spans are getting lower. We're relying on AI so much. And with all of these technical changes that are happening over time, I think one thing that will always remain is people's emotions. And if your design can bring up an emotion in somebody, and if it's a positive thing, it could be a great design. Whether it's an emotion of like, oh, I've solved a problem, that's good. If it's a negative emotion, I think it can still be a good design, maybe visually, but it won't be a good design as a whole because you haven't touched on an emotion positively. And I don't have a great ending for this, sorry.
Round of applause. Well done. Any feedback?
I think you had a great ending. You just ended slightly too soon.
Yes. I should have spoken slower.
Anyone else?
I really liked how you did move around and slowly made eye contact with each direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it made me focus more on following.
But ADHD.
Yeah.
It's well
Um,
said.
I think you manage to connect with your audience.
Mm.
So at the start, for example, like literally just expressing how you're feeling, that makes you connect with the audience.
Mm. Any other thoughts? Yeah, I think you did a really good job. I especially like that you addressed the fact that the question is a tricky one. Like that, nobody wants to answer what great design is in front of designers. And the fact that you acknowledge that is actually a really, really good technique. Especially if it's something that you're not sure that you're going to be able to talk about. Because then essentially your audience knows it's like, okay, this is difficult for anybody who has to do it. That was really well done. The other thing that I would say is, if you end early and have nothing more to say, just own it. You don't even have to acknowledge that you ended early. Literally just like stand there for the last 5 seconds. Because one of the things that people often get wrong is if they make a mistake or they stumble, they start talking about the fact that they made a mistake or that they stumbled or they've been saying a lot. I've said a whole bunch of times through this, and I just kind of assume that it doesn't matter and nobody really cares or recognizing it. So if something like that does happen, just kind of own it and move on. But overall, that was really good. Okay, so this is the first game that we're going to be playing. But I want to show you a little bit of the second game. So I really, really love the second game. It is also quite difficult. But I would say it's my superpower as a speaker. It's one of the things that I'm really good at. And it's still difficult for me, so just be patient with yourself. This one is called Conductor. And this game is specifically about helping you develop how to use tone of voice effectively when you're telling a story. And I found, especially for people who are a little bit more soft-spoken, this can literally change the direction of your career. If you learn how to articulate yourself with different tones of voice, not only are you able to sort of capture emotion, but you're also able to better express what's going on in your mind. Because I think often people who are a little bit more soft-spoken can feel like they don't really get heard. And now, I'm not saying that you have to shout at people, but it's actually, because it's not the volume. The thing that's important is the variation. Because the variation, it's kind of like contrast in design. If everything is the same sort of range of contrast, you can't really tell the difference about what's important and what's not. But when there's a lot of contrast, it's clear what's important. And the same thing applies to your voice. So this one will just leave minute 10. Okay, so with this game, you'll also get a theme. But then the thing that's different this time around is you will see as the time goes, a number come up on the screen as you're speaking. Now, this time around, you actually have to have your eye on the screen. You can't just turn it and look at everyone. Because every time, essentially what you need to do is match your tone of voice and energy with the number that's up there. It's like 1 is really soft and calm and slow. And 10 is a little bit more active and engaged and full of energy. And it's gonna make you change up and down. And it's not gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then down. It's gonna go from like 3 to 7 to 5 to 10 to like. So you kind of need to have your eye on it and just kind of follow as far as you can. So let me give it a go. Okay. Who am I doing this for? Who am I doing this for? Well, maybe let's talk about what we're talking about here today. And so I have mentioned the fact that this is relevant to the UX industry. But there's something more important. Because I am doing this not for the people who are going to become speakers, but I'm doing this for the people who are going to be in the audience. I'm doing this for the people who have to sit through boring presentations and just almost want to fall asleep. But I instead want this to be something that is engaging. And every single talk at UX South Africa this year, it's going to be powerful.
Yeah.
And it's going to be powerful not because of the content. It's going to be powerful because of the way people speak, the energy and the belief that they have in what they're talking about. But more than that, I'm doing this for the lives that are going to be changed as a result of what they learn. All right. So, as you can see, a thing I forgot to mention is you can get the breathe, and when breathe comes up, you just stop. and you wait for it to end, and then you continue. And so it's going to be really difficult, especially the first time that you do it. But you can see, like, I was really just babbling. But babbling with emotion is really compelling. All right, so who'd like to give this one a try? Please. Let's give her a hand. You ready? Yes, so it's going to repeat. The topic's going to come up, and then you'll need to keep your eye on. It's a little bit difficult to see what the thing is, so you'll kind of need to keep two eyes. Right.
So, growing up, we had lots of computers in home and had the opportunity to learn to work with technology at a comfortable level. And I think this really benefited us, especially moving into society nowadays where technology is all around us. We have AI popping up here and there. It's the new buzzword. But will it plateau out? I don't know. Or will it take over the world? We'll have to see about that. But let's just keep calm. I'm sure there's lots of good uses. But it is really important to learn to work with AI because it's the future. Become comfortable with technology, incorporate it in your everyday life, and that's how you set yourself apart from other people in the world, especially since we're all here in the tech world.
Nice. Nice. 10 is always really difficult. It almost feels uncomfortable. Not almost, it does. Any feedback? Any thoughts?
Me, I'm your friend. I think you did super great. You matched almost all of the tones pretty well. But I think there's a really fine line between like drama or performance versus varying your tone for a speech. And you did the performance part really well, which means we're definitely staying focused. But I think there can sometimes be a line that where it goes over, not into comedy, but where we focus maybe too much on it. But I think you did really well.
Any other thoughts?
Just a question.
Yes.
Tone 10. When do you know you're screaming? When do you know you are screaming?
And the people in the audience.
Well, that's not actually the right question. The question is, when is screaming not the right thing? Because sometimes it's okay to scream. Not often, granted, not often. But sometimes it is.
Right?
I mean, when you're doing a war cry or rallying people as they're about to go into battle, although that doesn't happen too often.
If you're screaming danger. Fire.
Yeah. So yeah, it's not very often, and I think the thing to remember is that the numbers are not necessarily volume. It is energy, intensity, and tone. Yes?
Now that you say that, I'm thinking about the differences between the way that you both did 10, and your 10 was like intense, it was loud, but it was intense. It was like, and what I want to do. And your 10 was like more of the, hey, kind of a shout kind of 10, or very loud kind of 10. And I think your question is also very good. When do you know when you are going too far into the 10? And how to draw yourself back without going from 10 to 1.
It really depends on a personality as well.
That's true.
I mean, you have Trump, who's a specific type of speaker. And you have someone like Martin Luther King, and they spoke really differently, but their personalities got expressed through their way of speaking.
If I can add it, not only depends on the personality of the speaker, but also the audience.
Yes.
If you're teaching kids, they might be more attentive to a bit more drama. And if you're in an old age home, or maybe you have to keep those people awake too, I don't know.
Let's go into the afterlife. Yeah, that's a very good point.
And I guess also context as well, like what you're speaking about.
Yes.
If you're speaking about like the new like moving the apps button like from here to here. I think that needs to be like super intense. It might feel a bit out of place. Whereas
the company.
well, exactly. But like maybe if the intensity is better on like will this save you like millions of rands, or is it like this is just a slightly better experience that we're getting across here?
No, that's very true. I think one other thing that I'd say, especially about the when are you sort of speaking too loudly and so on, I think the thing to remember is you're only speaking too loudly if everybody hasn't followed you on the emotional journey. And the way to think about it is like a composer. If a song just starts at maximum volume, it's like, what is going on? How did we get there? But if there's like a build-up and slowly it's going, and then the cymbals are clashing and the drums are going off, and it's loud, but you've joined along on that journey. And that's the way to think about it, is you're taking them on a journey. Does that make sense? Cool. Who wants to give this one a try before we break up into our groups? Thank you.
Okay.
Ready?
Yep. As I'll ever be. Ooh. So, I mean, I have so many ideas all the time. I'm definitely one of those people that has something in their life and they just want to find a way to like fix it, make it a little bit more useful. How can I make it more efficient? All my friends get really annoyed when I talk about just how bad the UX is. I mean, I don't know if you guys have like just been to a shop and you're trying to do something and it just is not working. Just sometimes I have to force myself to breathe, because sometimes I really just do not understand why people do not create the types of apps that could really make a difference. I am trying to do that right now with a user testing app, and that was a terrible time. Now that I got you in the climax of what I'm creating, the user testing app is something that I think can really help everybody to actually make a better world for us. And I don't think it should be only digital products. I think it can also be for the physical products around us. I shouldn't have to struggle to check out on my phone, and I shouldn't have to struggle to check out in a shop.
Well done. Any feedback?
I think I noticed, like, with the different people going up, you know, the 10 and the 1, instead of like with the 10 screaming or shouting, but I don't know, like energy, not passion. You know, when you're speaking very passionate about a topic, and you don't have to scream, you can be, oh, you know, you have to do this, and then sometimes someone might take it with a 10 and, oh, sometimes you have to do something like this, you know? So I think passion is also like a very important, what would I say, important
element. Yeah. So that's a really good point. And it's like, I'm actually surprised at how good everyone is doing. Because often, like, it's rare that you get to speak at a 10. And so you actually don't know what your voice is like at a 10. And in actual fact, and that's why it's good to practice this with people, but also to practice it alone when you're sort of like in the safety of the shower or your bedroom, and actually get to know your own voice and what does your voice sound like at a 10. Like whether it's 10 at a level of energy, whether it's 10 at a level of passion, whether it's 10 at a level of volume. And knowing each of those different 10s and when to use each one. Because sometimes a 10 of volume is relevant, but you can have a 10 of intensity that's a 5 of volume. And so kind of practicing those in different ways and at different times can really get you to turn your voice into an instrument effectively. All right.
I just wanted to mention, like, I think I only thought about it like halfway through, but something that you did, and then for me, when like the 10 went to a 1, I kept on thinking like it's a massive change. And then for all the other times, I felt like I had to immediately change. I kind of panicked. I needed to go. So I lost my train of thought. But I think what I just realized now that you did is you didn't rush it. So yes, it was there. And like, obviously this is a task. You kind of want to follow it. But you did still like finish your thought before going to that next thing. So I mean, obviously this is a different to real world, but I think it can be a similar thing of you might have planned this, or maybe there's something that interrupted you, but you can just like take time to finish and it feels right moving to that next space.
That's a really good point. And
Yeah.
in a sense, I think the name really encapsulates that, because the conductor is not playing what is the musicians are playing. The conductor is playing a step ahead. So like when they do a thing, the musicians will play like on the next beat. And so you kind of want to think about this like that. It'll show you a number, and then it's kind of like you cue it in your head that the next thing that you'll say will be that level of energy.
Yeah.
Yes.
When you need to present something within a specific time frame, and that time frame is longer than the usual attention span of the average audience,
Yes.
how do you work around that? So let's say, because ideally you don't want to speak more than 15 minutes, but let's say you have to fill up half an hour or an hour without losing the audience. How do you get past that? Because I mean, there's only 1 to 10, there's not 1 to 50. So you only have so much to work with.
Do you? Well, let me put it this way. Now, though he is not a great person, Hitler had people out there for hours, going and going and going. The length is not what's important. And as cliche as it sounds, it's the journey. You see, the thing to remember is like, there are 2 things you want to avoid when you're talking really long. You want to avoid overwhelming, so you don't want to talk about many things. Just because you're talking for long doesn't mean you have to talk about many things. The second is you want to make sure that your audience is with you along the way. I mean, I've been speaking today for like already almost an hour and a half. But I always ensure that I pause, I make sure everyone's with me. I ensure that I've got like facts, I've got stories, I've got jokes. Like, the thing that gets an audience bored is the fact that they're not progressing towards a question. So this is kind of like how I think about it. It's one of the ways that I speak without any notes. As you can see today, I've got no notes. I'm just kind of talking. And it's what we'll get into in the workshop element of this, is the technique somewhat invented, somewhat adapted. I kind of call it the hub and spoke. So at the center, I've got a central point, and that's guided by the seed question. But then I've got sub-questions. So it's essentially questions which are relevant to the initial question that kind of go in different directions. And each one of them slightly contributes to the thing that I'm talking about, right? Now, the reason this is important is it allows me to vary the length of what I'm talking about. So when I want to speak about a subject, I ensure that I've got about maybe like 2.5 times the amount of content I want to speak about. So that if I need to expand it, I can pull pieces out and keep just the bare bones. If I need to contract it, and if I need to expand, then I'll add in some of the extra pieces. But what I ensure is that each piece by itself is a short story. So in actual fact, a 90-minute talk is actually just 10 9-minute talks. And that's how you keep your audience engaged. Because at the end of each talk, they're kind of going through that arc. And each arc is contributing to a bigger arc. And that's essentially how movies work. It's like each scene is a mini story. And each scene has got its own resolution, but it contributes to the larger thing. And that's how you keep an audience engaged for a long time. Yes?
Oh, sort of like a story within a story.
Exactly. Yeah. So yes?
You make people play games in between.
This is also highly useful. But like, that's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but also true.
Yeah.
Is like, especially if you're going to talk really long, you want to ensure that the audience gets to engage. And what that also really does, it's important, is it allows you to see if your audience is following you. Because, for example, if I'm like, does anybody want to come up, and they don't even realize we're talking about public speaking. And it's clear that like I missed something and there is more context that I need to provide. Yes.
So I have a question. It's kind of like what he's asking, but in a reverse. And I think some of what you said applies. But I've been in that position many times in meetings or calls or presentations where you end up with a much shorter time than you thought you would have. So you thought you'd have 30 minutes to do your presentation, make your point. You end up with 15 minutes. Any tips?
Yeah. So one of the things I'd immediately say is a short time is harder than a long time, by far. Like, granted, a long time feels harder because you always have or it theoretically feels harder because you're like, oh, I need to be up for this amount of time. I don't have enough to say. But like, people are a little bit more forgiving when it's a long time. But if you're going to speak for like 15 minutes and like you don't actually say anything meaningful, I'm just like, why did you even stand up? So there are a couple of things that I would say is when you're talking really short, the question needs to be crystal clear. It's like why you're listening to me. Like essentially, you condense the things that you're talking about a lot. And it's why I really like that hub and spoke approach is that it's not actually linearly connected. So it can shrink and expand as you like. I can't remember the name of the guy who does this website. I'm quickly going to Google it because I think it's really important. Tristan de Montebello. So he invented a thing that is extremely important for the thing that you're describing, right? He's got a technique for practicing. So Tristan de Montebello. If you're interested in this at all, I'd really highly recommend that podcast. It's on Lenny's podcast. If you haven't heard of it, and he speaks there. And one of the things he talks about is this idea called the accordion method, and it's a way of practicing a specific talk you want to give. And so what he essentially does is he essentially gives you three categories. So you'll be giving a talk and you'll first give it in, let's say, a minute and a half or 5 minutes, and you'll give the talk the first time. Then he'll kind of cut that in half, and you give it in half the time, right? And then you'll see, like, these are the parts that I can cut off, and you probably won't get it right the first time, but you'll see these are the things that I can leave out, these are the things that I can't leave out, these are the parts that are important. Then you'll cut it down even further to like 30 seconds, and you give that talk in 30 seconds. Literally as short as you can get it, and then you go back up. And what that does is it lets you see which parts of it are like the fluff, which is like the decorations to your talk, and which are the key parts. And if you keep going through that, it allows you to distill the talk by having to contract and expand it. And if you do that a couple of times, one, it increases the quality of your talk because you see where are the key points, and that lets you know when to have vocal variation. But more than that, it lets you know which are the parts that you can skip over. And maybe if you're not very comfortable in speaking on your feet, it also lets you know the parts that you can just skip if you forget, versus the parts that are worth going back to if you forget. Does that make sense?
That's great advice. Yeah, indeed.
Cool. So my advice bit. Just a message.
The question on that, like to cut back, like I am someone who I find lots of things interesting. I'm passionate about lots of things interest me. So I want to know like the full story. So for example, like cutting down, to me, a lot of it like background story is important and that kind of stuff. So I often struggle to know what to cut back that like other people would find to a point where other people would find it interesting, because I find it all interesting.
That's a fair question. I'll almost say essentially like the advice that approach gives is actually intuitive.
Okay.
And you actually identify the parts that can be left and the parts that can't by practicing and iterating. So what you'll find, for example, and it's great to actually have somebody to do this with, is you'll kind of do it, and then at the end you'll realize like, oh, this would have been better if I said that thing.
Yeah.
Or it's sort of like, you'll say it and then you realize like, I didn't actually need to say that and then I ran out of time.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like through practicing it, you see the parts that can be left out.
I guess also then possibly, as you're saying, having someone. So
Yes.
Because I think I've done that before. I've kind of done a talk, and you can kind of see when you lose some. Face just kind of.
Eyes glacial.
Yeah. So I guess that's also a way, is if you're really stuck, say it for someone, even if they aren't technically the audience.
Definitely. Cool. Any other questions? All right, I think it's time for us to break up into groups.